Formerly, what has been said can be expressed thus. The general state of the judgment or proposition which involves the distinction of subject and predicate is destroyed by the speculative proposition, and the proposition of identity which the former becomes contains the counterthrust against that subject-predicate relationship. This conflict between the general form of a proposition and the unity of the notion which destroys it is similar to the conflict that occurs in rhythm between meter and accent. Rhythm results from the floating center and the unification of the two. So too in the philosophical proposition, the identification of subject and predicate is not meant to destroy the difference between them, which the form of the proposition expresses. Their unity rather is meant to emerge as a harmony. The form of the proposition is the appearance of the determinate sense or the accent that distinguishes its fulfillment, but that the predicate expresses the substance and that the subject itself falls into the universal. This is the unity in which the accent dies away. In section 61, Hegel is continuing this discussion about subjects and predicates and about the forms of propositions or judgments. And why does he say proposition or judgment? Because these are two different acts or two different products of the reasoning, the thinking individual, or just the repeating individual as well, the mimic. And what's going on in these? When one makes a judgment, one predicates something of a subject. That's the grammatical form of it. And we're often tempted to think that the logical form, in the sense of what's really going on in the intelligibility of what's being talked about, is the same thing as the grammatical form. As a matter of fact, for some people, they're willing to collapse logic and grammar into each other. Hegel wants to resist that, not because, he thinks that grammar is something special or even logic is something, intrinsically special, but because that just doesn't fit the way that consciousness actually develops and the way that consciousness grasps things. That's what this section, whether you realize it or not, is really about. He's saying, formally expressed, here's what we can say about this, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But what he's really getting at is why this subject-predicate understanding, where the subject is kind of just a hanger to put predicates on, why that can't capture what's going on in philosophy and in our relations with the world, our understanding of ourself, our situating ourself in history. So that's a lot of, backstory, you might say, or revealing what's going on, but I think that's kind of helpful here. So he says, formally what's been said, the general nature of the judgment or proposition. So when we engage in a judgment, we are affirming that something is the case, or we are deciding that something is the case. We're saying that it appears that way to us. A proposition is expressing that something is the case. And you might say, what's the difference between those? One involves sort of an active stance upon whatever it is that we're discussing. The other can be much more passive. A proposition can be just kind of floating out there, and you say, well, yeah, I think that's the way it is. When you say that, you're making a judgment about your relation to the proposition. So, the general form of or the general nature of the judgment or proposition involves a distinction between subject and predicate. I am a college professor. I am the subject. Predicate is a college professor. Or just college professor, and we can say there's a copula there, the verb is, depending on how we want to parse this out. Now he says it's destroyed by the speculative proposition. So this seems to imply that there is something out there called the speculative proposition, the speculative Satz. Satz is proposition or sentence, and that's not actually going to be the case. We might say better the speculative handling of propositions, because as we're going to see a little bit later on, we can't completely get away from this. We can't get away from grammar. We can't get away from using words in ways that are familiar to us, even while we're doing speculative philosophy. So then he says it's destroyed by the speculative proposition and the proposition of identity, or the identity proposition. Identische Satz is how the German runs. which the former contains the counter thrust against that subject-predicate relationship. So he's saying it doesn't completely destroy it, it doesn't do away with subject and predicate, but what it does is it gives us a richer relationship between them that we can actually understand, we can wrap our heads around. So we've seen this quite often in the previous proposition, or the previous sections, right? He'll say the subject, which we take to be sort of an inert thing, we take it as that which we know best, and we just sort of predicate other things of it. Turns out that when we look at it closely, if the subject really is a subject, it's got agency, it is not passive, and the subject sort of ebbs or bleeds itself into the predicate, and the predicate becomes a thing that we actually know the subject through. Later on he's going to talk, and also in the logic he's going to talk about essence and appearance. Essence shows itself by appearing, by having some sort of agency, by having some sort of activity. And in this he says there's a difference between the subject and the predicate. And we've seen this, played out in many passages so far. Things self-other, if they're self-moving objects or self-moving subjects, what they do is they become other to themselves and then they reincorporate that otherness into themselves. That's this establishment of difference. And then there's, I almost put unity at first, but it really is unification of the subject and the predicate. How do they become unified? By us knowing the subject through its predicate. By us realizing that the subject becomes other to itself through having the predicate, and then it gets reappropriated into that. So he says, how should we understand this? And this is where he's got a really interesting metaphor, a musical metaphor. Now, you have to understand a little bit about ancient use of rhythm, meter, and stress in poetry for this to make sense to you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on that. Ancient Greek and Latin poetry does not concentrate on end rhyme like our poetry does, in English, I mean. And so what they focus on is meter. So, you could have a foot, as they call it, where it's long, short, short, or you could have, short, short, long. These are different kinds of feet, short, short, long, long. That's what we call meter. And what do they mean by long there? Well, the word would be stretched out, and that would be done because certain vowels had, long quantity, and other vowels would be short. So, here's just a line from, I forget exactly who this is from, it might be an acronym. Halapos de me philestai, halapos de te philestai, halapoteron de panton, hapantamanon philestai. So that's a very short poetic piece. And you notice that it has a rhythm to it. Da 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 da. So it's got a meter to it, and if we wanted to express that meter, it would be da 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 da. Almost like Morse code, right? Short, long. Morse code is kind of like that. Now we add to it the accent. Accent means stress. Da 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 da. We put that in there, and we could do this with this, da 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 da. If we're doing it like that, it's da 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 da. Well, we might change the accent up. Da 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 da. And that changes the way that it comes across. That's changing the rhythm. Now, we don't have this, like I said, very much in our current poetry. When it's done with some sort of verse, we tend to have fairly simple constructions. Iambic pentameter is a good example of that. Da 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 da. Is that right? It should be 5 feet pentameter. And it's just going like that. You can monkey around with it a bit when you actually know how to do it right, but that's the basic idea. Greek and Latin poetry used that as its basis for rhythm. German poetry, and we're talking about really old German poetry, things like the Nibelungenlied, didn't worry so much about meter, but they did worry about accent, and they used a thing called Stabreim, which means stress rhyme. Now, we have something like this. It's used in lyricism in songs, and it's used particularly in spoken word music, like rap or hip-hop, where the rhythm really matters, and the rhythm is consisting of meter and accent. So all of that, that's fine. Now we've got that down. Why does Hegel bring that up, and why did I bother to explain that? Notice that it doesn't have this sort of connection. It's not like there's a subject and then we just predicate things of it, sort of like putting, first we have Greg Sadler, the body, and then we put on a shirt, and then we put on a tie, and then we put on a jacket covering it. Instead, these things interpenetrate each other. That's the really key thing here. Rhythm is a kind of harmony, a coming together harmoniously, sympathetically, interpenetrating each other, of meter and accent. Similarly, Hegel is saying that conceptually what's going on in the notion is the subject and the predicate are interpenetrating each other. How are they doing that? Through us. We're able to understand them like that. So he says the form of the proposition is the appearance of the determinate sense or the accent that distinguishes its fulfillment. But that the predicate expresses the substance, and that the subject itself falls into the universal. This is the unity in which the accent dies away. So what we're looking at here is really the death of the subject, if we want to be very dramatic about that. And he's got much more to say about that, but we'll look at that in future sections. To illustrate what has been said, in the proposition God is being, the predicate is being. It has the significance of something substantial in which the subject is dissolved. Being is here meant to be not a predicate, but rather the essence. It seems consequently that God ceases to be what he is from his position in the proposition, that is, a fixed subject. Here, thinking, instead of making progress in the transition from subject to predicate, in reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject, and missing it is thrown back on the thought of the subject. Or, since the predicate itself has been expressed as a subject, as the being, or essence, which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate, and now, having returned into itself in the predicate, instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument, it is still absorbed in the content, or at least is faced with the demand that it should be. Similarly, too, when one says the actual is the universal, the actual as subject disappears in its predicate. The universal is not meant to have entirely the significance of a predicate, as if the proposition asserted only that the actual is universal. On the contrary, the universal is meant to express the essence of the actual. Thinking, therefore, loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject when in the predicate it is thrown back onto the subject, and when in the predicate it does not return into itself, but into the subject of the content. In section 62, Hegel is giving us a very helpful illustration, actually two illustrations of what he's just been trying to get across to us in the last several paragraphs. And again, we're dealing with subject and predicate relations. And so he wants to say, consider this example. God is being. So, why would somebody say that? Well, it's really a commonplace if you are a traditional theist of a certain sort. This is actually where a lot of people who are not theists or who are not traditional theists actually misunderstand some of the ontological claims lying behind traditional theism, traditional Christian, traditional Jewish, traditional Muslim ideas of things. God doesn't have being for somebody like St. Anselm. God is being. Being, in a certain sense, is not exactly what it is for things like me or the chalk. Only the absolute being truly is being as such. So if we want to know the nature of being, then we have to somehow penetrate into the mystery of knowing what God is, right? Now, you don't have to necessarily accept that in order to understand what we're saying here and what we're getting at. So Hegel is picking up on something that, say Thomas Aquinas could have put forward, or René Descartes could have put forward. And he's saying, let's consider this now. In this proposition, God is being, what is going on? We have God as the subject, grammatically. God is, we're saying something about God, we're predicating something about God, and what are we doing? We're saying God is being. We could also say God is merciful, or God is loving, or God is angry today, or God is, 23.5 centimeters tall. We could come up with all sorts of predicates, but we're picking is being at this time. So he says, being, as the predicate, has the significance of something substantial in which the subject is dissolved. So I'm going to put a number of things up here, just, adding to our understanding of what Hegel's saying. So being here is something that is substantial. It's saying God is a kind of thing. God is a kind of substance. Whatever being happens to be, in the fullest sense. And from the vantage point of the thinking subject, now, we've seen this before, the subject is passing over into its predicate. If we want to know what the subject is, we can't just assume it as a fixed starting point. There's ways of doing philosophy where that's precisely what you do. You begin with these fixed axioms and then, move out from there. Hegel's saying, no, if we actually want to learn anything about anything, that's not the way we actually do it. We begin with something that we think that we know, then we predicate something, and it turns out that the predicate is a hell of a lot more intelligible than what we began with. And now we say, now I get it. What this is this actually thing, this over here. Now I'm starting to understand. So, being is something substantial in that case. And the subject is being dissolved. He says, being is here not meant to be a predicate. That's why I have this predicate, or, but rather the essence, the Wesen in German, the very being of the being in a certain sense. And what's the significance of this? To say that it's not just a predicate, but the essence. It's saying that we're getting at the heart of the thing. If we want to say something like, imagine we're trying to talk about a person, and you say, I want to hire this guy. What can you tell me about him? He starts out with sort of an X, and maybe he's got, certain attributes. He walks into the office. He's dressed in a coat and tie. And you say, is this guy a schmuck? Is he, somebody who's high caliber? Is he a thief? Is he a stand-up guy? Now you're asking me for predicates. And if you want to get to the very heart of the matter, you're actually looking for something like an essence. You're actually looking for me to tell you, who is this person at heart? Who is this person at his core? And so let's say that I've known this person my entire life, and I say, this is somebody who you don't want to trust. I could tell you all sorts of stories about him, but I'm going to crystallize those in one thing that I'm going to say. He is totally disreputable. Now I'm saying something about that person's essence. Could be false, could be true. Don't worry about that at this point. The main thing is to see what Hegel's actually talking about here when he's talking about essence. Talking about something that's the heart of the matter. And now all the other stuff about that guy just kind of dissolves into this thing that I've predicated of him, or the essence which I've revealed. That becomes his substantiality. And another way of thinking about this is the subject has been lost. The thinking subject, which is us, we're watching the subject being lost. Why? Well, because what's happened over here is we actually have the predicate as a new kind of subject. Something else that we can say something more about, right? So he says, the thinking, instead of making progress in the transition from subject to predicate, in reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject. Missing it is thrown back onto the thought of the subject. Or, since the predicate itself has been expressed as subject, as the being, the essence, which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate. So what is the subject here? It's really this here, and now we've found it within the predicate. Who was this guy that you were thinking of interviewing, that you have sitting in your office, biding his time while you come out and talk with me? Turns out that it's this over here. That's the same thing, and it's caught up within the side of the predicate. So he says, now having returned to itself in the predicate, instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument, it's still absorbed in the content. It becomes absorbed in this side, or at least is faced with the demand that it should be. Now Hegel's going to give us another example. So instead of God as being, and we start to look at, well, what is being? And then, once we start to explore it a bit, we find out that God is there inside of being, and it gets very complicated. Let's look instead at some other possibility. The actual, there's our subject, is the universal. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, in this case, he says, the universal is not meant to have merely the significance of a predicate, as if the proposition asserted only that the actual is universal. On the contrary, the universal is meant to express the, once again, essence of the subject. What it is to be actual is to be universal. Now we could tell a story. He's going to tell all sorts of stories about how this works. Let me just give you the quickest of thumbnail sketches about that. Part of what's going on with Hegel when he says that the actual is universal means that when something actually exists and has agency, when it matters, it assumes a kind of universalizing status. You might think of it as able to spread itself out into multiple contexts. We use this word transfer in education to talk from going from area to area to area. And we can think about that as also applying to human beings. So if it works for me, then if it's actual for me, then it's potentially actual for you. You can relate to it. It's attaining a kind of universality. If you become attracted into that, I might be the trendsetter who starts something actual, and now you're doing it. I mean, think about, for example, this as I forget which cultural critic called it, but part of the costume of the bourgeois man, the tie, right? At one point, this was, an innovation. Somebody started out with this, and eventually it caught on, and it attained a kind of universality. Do you have to wear a tie in a business setting or a professorial academic setting? No. As a matter of fact, you might actually, by using the tie, negatively produce the absence of the tie. You show a kind of informality or transcending the tie, but you're still using it as a universal in that case. Do you see how that works? So anyway, back to this. The same sort of dynamic is going on. The subject gets lost within the predicate and then gets found within the predicate again. We conceptualize, we come to understand, we attain the intelligibility of what it is to be actual by looking at this process of becoming universal. So he says, thinking therefore loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject that it began with. When in the predicate it's thrown back onto the subject, and when in the predicate it does not return into itself but into the subject of the content. So we've got this back and forth dialectic going on, and this is not something that attains a completely fixed, satisfying position at this point. We're going to have to go on further with respect to that. This is part of why the dialectic is dynamic. Negativity is pulling it through, you can say, and the negativity is partly on the part of the thinking subject. This abnormal inhibition of thought is in large measure the source of the complaints regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writings from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. Here we see the reason behind one particular complaint so often made against them, that so much has to be read over and over before it can be understood, a complaint whose burden is presumed to be quite outrageous and, if justified, to admit of no defense. It is clear from the above what this amounts to. The philosophical proposition, since it is a proposition, leads one to believe that the usual subject-predicate relation obtains, as well as the usual attitude towards knowing. But the philosophical content destroys this attitude and this opinion. We learn by experience that we meant something other than we meant to mean, and this correction of our meaning compels our knowing to go back to the proposition and understand it in some other way. So section 63 is dealing with something that is really close to my own experience and my heart, and it's actually kind of funny to think about, and probably something that a lot of people out there can relate to as well on both sides, the claiming things are unintelligible side and the being surprised by the fact that other people find it unintelligible and dismiss it for that reason. So Hegel's looking at this common complaint about philosophical writings, philosophical works. And I think this is just as true today as it was back in his time. It's probably always going to be true. He's probably got his finger on something very important there. As a matter of fact, as a corollary, if he's actually right about this, then it's probably the case that anything that is easily grasped and understood as such is probably, if not already, at least on the verge of becoming crap philosophy, which is to say not philosophy at all, but just sort of mumbling along, using some words, doing groupthink. You know, we could come up with all sorts of other ways of expressing this. So he says, this abnormal inhibition of thought, and what does he mean there? Going back to the previous two sections, the thinking subject trying to make sense out of philosophical propositions, which do have this subject-predicate form, and going back and forth, finding that the subject, it loses itself in the predicate, but the predicate doesn't seem to get reabsorbed back into the subject, but we find the subject within it, and so there's a kind of circularity there that tends to discomfort people. It tends to produce cognitive dissonance, particularly since we always tend to think that if there's some circularity there, that it's vicious circularity. Hegel's saying that it's not. So he says it's the source of the complaints regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writings, and here's where he says something really interesting, from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. So he's not worried about people who, you know, because either they rejected the opportunities given them, or they were never given the opportunities, or they simply aren't up to it with their mental capacities, the people who haven't had a good education. He's saying that even among the people who've had a good education, quite a few of them can't understand philosophy. This is true today. Why is it true? Well, because when you're really doing philosophy, you're engaging in a highly abstract, reflexive thinking process that there aren't hard and fast rules for, and requires you to do quite a bit of personal development in order to be able to make it work. Like I say to my students quite often, if you're reading the text and it's a classic text and you're not getting anything out of it, there's no problem with the text, there's a problem with you. And what you need to do is figure out how not to adapt the text to you via Spark Notes or, you know, Wikipedia articles or things like that. You need to figure out how to adapt your brain, your mind, your intellect to that text, because there's something out there that provides the standard for you. And usually what I'll do is I'll say, look at these other students. They're not any, you know, smarter or dumber than you, and yet they're able to understand what Plato's talking about, because here's their paper. So when you say, I just don't get it, or it's unintelligible, that's actually a mark against you, not a mark against the material. So he says, here we see one of the reasons. So much has to be read over and over before it can be understood. A complaint whose burden is presumed to be quite outrageous. If it's not clear the first time around, then, you know, there's something wrong with it. I see this in comments on my videos quite frequently. You know, there's two ways in which people frequently go wrong that I think Hegel could relate to. One is that, you know, I'll say in the description to the video, we're covering this idea or this section, and they'll ask me about all sorts of stuff way over here, you know. We're talking about something in Plato, and we're not talking about the theory of the forms, and then they want to ask me about the theory of the forms, or suggest that that's important here, or, you know, they don't want to actually hunker down and just fix their attention on this and see where this actually goes. And That's one problem. Same thing comes up sometimes in these half-hour Hegel videos and some of the comments on them. The other thing is, it does take, going over this material several times in many cases, and actually going to the text to make sense of it. So, another kind of comment that I get is people will ask me questions or raise objections or get into arguments based on what I'm saying in the video, and they're not reading the actual text that the video is just merely at best a reflection of. Same thing with this, if you're watching this and you're hoping that I'm going to communicate Hegel to you and you're not going to have to read it, there's something wrong here. You actually do have to do the work, the intellectual labor. Like Hegel said, right? The patience, the labor of the negative, you have to put that work in order to reap the benefits. And sometimes benefits are intellectual. So he's saying there's a lot of people in my day who, they didn't have Spark Notes. What they would do is read book reviews. What did Kant have to say about this? I'm not going to read the Kant. I'll just read, so-and-so's book review of it, and that'll be good enough for me. How do you know? It's sort of like the same problem with knowing what's a good translation or a bad translation if you don't read the original. How do you know if the translation of Hegel is good? How do you know if the translation of Plato is good? If you don't read Greek or you don't read German, and you don't actually, it's one thing to be able to read Greek or German, it's another to actually go to the text and say, I don't understand why he translated it this way. So these are all sort of good considerations to bring to the table. This common complaint, philosophical writings are unintelligible. Here's a bunch of questions that we ought to be asking that person. When somebody says that they're unintelligible, do they just mean they're unintelligible to me? And that's a mark against me? Because maybe they are intelligible. A lot of other people say that they are. I just can't seem to get it. That's not usually what the person is saying, though, is it? Usually they're saying, well, because it's unintelligible to me, it's unintelligible to everyone. Or it's unintelligible in itself. Because I can't understand Kant. Kant doesn't make any sense to anybody. He can't possibly be right. That's the sign of somebody who is, in a certain respect, well-educated, but in a certain respect, an ignoramus. To assume that simply because one is not in a position to understand something, that it is therefore completely unintelligible to everybody, when the evidence is other people saying, no, this actually can be understood, it's really a kind of strange defense mechanism or narcissism that people do. But Hegel's saying, look, people do this quite often. So he says, it's clear from the above what this amounts to. Why does this happen? Well, there's a reason for this. The philosophical proposition is in fact a proposition. It does in fact have this subject-predicate form. So that seduces us into thinking when we say something like, God is being. Let's say we take Anselm's prosologium, right? God is not only being, God cannot, by the time we get to chapter 4, God cannot even be coherently thought not to exist. He must, of necessity, exist. And yet God is, if you read further in, besides the so-called ontological proof, God is greater than what we understand as necessity. Well, that's kind of mind-blowing stuff. And if you think that the first time you read through it, you're going to get it just like that, you really have another thing coming. Concepts, if they're important concepts, if they're actual, robust concepts, they take us a while to come to terms with. I've been reading Anselm's Prosologion for close to 20 years now, and I still go back and forth as I read it about, does this make sense, or doesn't this make sense? And I've had, a few experiences where you sort of break through to the other side, and now you see things in very different ways as a result. But that's because, he's working with philosophical propositions. Hegel is too. Hegel is going to actually consider Anselm, not in this, but in his lectures on the philosophy of religion and the so-called ontological proof. So he's saying the philosophical content destroys the attitude and opinion of the normal way of dealing with subject-predicate. This is something that we've seen so far. We learn by experience that we meant something other than we meant to mean. This is kind of a funny thing. We learn from experience What experience? The experience of thinking. Also the experience of reading somebody else. Also the experience of trying to communicate those insights with other people. Also the experience of trying to take this batch of ideas and apply them to the world and to our own experience. We have experience about experience. We have experience about trying to conceptualize, trying to make sense out of in a dynamic, adequate way our experience. So we have an experience, he says, that we meant something other than what we meant to mean. You might say this is totally incoherent. No, we have this sort of experience all the time. We are fallible creatures. We start out thinking one thing and we come out the other end of the tunnel thinking something different. And what took place in the middle? We thought more about it. We realized that we were actually wrong about things. When I've got the subject predicate over here, we think that we know what a subject is. We predicate some things of it. We think about what that predicate means. The predicate reveals the essence. And now we see the subject in a whole different way. There's nothing mysterious about this. There is something laborious about this. And because it's laborious, a lot of people are unwilling to put in the time. But if you don't put in the time, you won't receive the benefit, which is making sense out of what it is, not just that Hegel has here in this book, but the vistas that Hegel is opening up to us.